Well, good afternoon. I want to take you from the latter part of the lifespan back to the beginning part of the lifespan, and I want to talk with you about understanding differential vulnerability for intellectual disabilities and what we might be able to do to prevent that. And I'm going to summarize about 5 decades of our research in 19 minutes. How we treat our children makes a big difference socially, economically, ethically across the entire world. And children thrive to the extent that we organize and deliver the kind of essential services, whether it's in families or in healthcare settings or educational settings. And what we know worldwide is that children who come from very limited economic and social circumstances, whose families have gotten sort of the short end of the stick, are predictably at elevated risk for a number of poor outcomes, including intellectual disabilities. Children are not very powerful constituents, and so they are frequently among the least likely to be considered in terms of allocation of resources. And when we approach this at the human level, we are essentially dealing with what is an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary perspective that involves lots of different disciplines. I've had roughly about 800 colleagues I've worked with over the last 10 years, and what we've been trying to do is to see if we can identify highly vulnerable children, bring preventive services to bear, and see if we cannot improve outcomes. Of course, it's complicated. But one of the areas that we know to be critically important is here in the middle in red. It's the kind of social interactions children have with their parents and caregivers, and we now know a lot about the dimensions and qualities of variation in those social interactions and how such a profound influence is had. And of course, these interactions result in encodement into memory, to changes in basic neurobiology, such that over time we come to anticipate that different individuals will behave in predictable ways. That's why it requires large teams of people, typically to do the kind of work that I find fascinating. I'm going to scan through some of these studies conducted over the last 50 years with various groups of individuals that I'll characterize extremely briefly just to get to the main points. But essentially we're asking the question, can we prevent intellectual and learning disabilities? And does prevention of disabilities lead to practical improvements in academic and social competence? I'm very fond of doing randomized controlled trials, but that's only one tool in a very large toolkit that we need. But I'm also very interested in trying to control extraneous factors, and typically we have no control group that is an untreated control group. So in this, my first study, the children in the control group received nutritional supplements, their families received supportive social services, and they received low cost or free medical care according to the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. The treated group received those things, and in addition, we created a early childhood educational center. The children entered the center at 6 weeks of age. They attended from 7:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, until they went to kindergarten. So it's a very intensive treatment, and in the context of that treatment, we had an individualized curriculum that was based on the child's rate of progress in 27 separate developmental areas. Whoops. We began with very disadvantaged families and children. And this slide just gives you a brief summary. We're talking about a group of children, all of whom come from well below the poverty line, whose mothers on average had measured IQs in the mid-80s, who tended to be young, who tended to be African American, and the families tended to be female-headed. What I want to show you is this green line is the expected range of performance of children for a general population. So an IQ of 100, for example, is the population average. And in these slides, red will always symbolize the group that got the additional educational treatment, and yellow will always symbolize the control group children. But bear in mind, the control group is not an untreated control group. So if we look at the performance, and there are 57 kids in this group, we see that they start off looking quite normal down here at 3 months of age, but in the second year of life, they begin to show substantial intellectual declines as measured by blindly administered full cognitive assessments, IQ tests. And you see along this line the magnitude of the effect in comparison to the treated group expressed in standard deviation units. So essentially, this treatment has prevented these children from dropping into ranges of subnormality. Note also that there is a rise in the performance of these children here. What we were able to do was to, on a regular basis, go and see where the control group children were, and we found that some of those children were being placed in alternative early childhood programs. And what we found is that the kids who were not placed in alternative programs continued to remain quite low, and those who had some exposure outside their homes were intermediate to those who were in this very intensive program. What this tells me is that the program we created for experimental purposes was not unique in its ability to have a positive influence, but what we also know is that when we created this program, there were very few other programs that began as early or were as intensive. So this began to give us a clue about kind of a dose-response kind of relationship. This graph shows, if we simply look at the percentage of children who remain within normal intellectual ranges, meaning having an IQ above 84, what you see is that by 4 years of age, 95% of the kids who got the treatment are within that range, but only 45% of the kids in the control group. We also know we followed these children now, and we're bringing them here in their mid-40s, but we also know that there were certain practical consequences that occurred as they progressed through school. So the early treatment reduced the likelihood of being retained in grade, and it reduced the likelihood of the children being placed in special education. This slide is simply a summary of, we've published in this and the other studies I'll talk about, we've published about 450 papers. This slide just captures some big positive influences and some things that have been negatively affected. And you can sort of scan down. We know we can improve intelligence, reading and math scores after the kids hit school. We increase the likelihood of these children going to college by 4 times and graduating from college. There's a whole list of positive things, and similarly, these children show a reduction in these untoward and undesired outcomes. So the effects are not small, and they're not simply statistically significant. They tend to be large and real world. We have replicated this study. We replicated it once in North Carolina with the same kind of children and got a replication of the findings in something that we called Project CARE. And then we had the opportunity to take the same procedures and apply them in an 8-site randomized controlled trial for low birth weight and premature children. As you well know, low birth weight and premature children come from all walks of life across the socioeconomic spectrum, but they tend to come disproportionately from the lower end of the spectrum, in large part because low birth weight is something that is contributed to by a large number of factors. It's not a single factor determined outcome. So we were able to make slight modifications to our program and then to implement it in 8 sites around the country. And those sites were University of Arkansas, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Harvard, University of Miami, University of Pennsylvania, University of Texas, University of Washington, and Yale. And these are the results at age 3, which are remarkably similar to the same results we saw in our previous 2 studies at that time as well. We ran this study only from birth to age 3 because we were really interested in determining whether that differential in levels of development, which we already knew to occur within those first 3 years, could be offset. And this was a quite expensive study to conduct. We had to build 8 child development centers and create 8 transportation systems and a bunch of other things. So we stopped it at age 3. This is, I think, a very informative slide for me. We enrolled almost 1,000 kids in this study. And because children came from different social and economic backgrounds, we were able to mark off their social risk by looking at whether their mothers had some high school, were high school graduates, had some college, or were college graduates. Again, yellow is the control group, and remember this is not a no treatment group. What you see is that by age 3, the children who come from, well, first of all, you see that parental socioeconomic status already predicts children's cognitive performance by age 3. It does it also at age 2. It does not at age 1. It's a developmental phenomenon that we think we know something about at this point. But look at what the treatment has done. It has really, to a remarkable degree, leveled the playing field and made these kids within spitting distance of the performance of children from college-educated families, meaning that it has had a disproportionately positive influence on the children who were at greatest risk. And level of participation in the intervention is important. In all of these studies, well over 90% of all people who were eligible have participated. Well over 90% have participated fully all throughout the study. But nevertheless, there are relationships between the degree of participation and the degree of risk expressed. And what this does is simply to take the children who were in our control group in this study and look at the percentage of children with IQs below 85 or below 70, and then to simply divide out the treatment group into those that were had very low participation rates, or medium or high. And what you see here is a kind of a dose-response relationship that exists even when we control for 13 factors statistically that one might expect to be related to participation. So, and it isn't just with respect to cognitive performance that children's development is affected. This simply looks at the performance of the children at 12, 24, and 36 months. These are classes of measures that were taken. And by the way, no one ever saw the same child twice. All the data were collected by people who were blinded to the treatment condition. So we tried to do this as tightly as we could. And what you see is that there's a fairly large cascade of differences that occur over time. Here a plus means the treatment comparison group was significant, NS means it was not significant, and the dash means it simply wasn't measured at that time because it wasn't developmentally appropriate. There are long-term effects in this program as well. We followed those children out to age 18. We know that the children who came from the most vulnerable families are the ones who showed the biggest benefit, and those benefits persist at least out for as long as they've been studied, out to age 18. And then the question is, well, if we're doing this, why aren't we scaling this up and meeting the population where the needs exist? And so for the last few years, we've been working in Louisiana, and we have been scaling up a program designed to begin when kids are 4 years old, because we're trying to ask what's the minimum that's necessary to have an effect. These children are not quite as much at risk as the children in the other studies. They are in this study if they have parents who qualify for what's called meeting the standards for free and reduced lunch for their children, typically at 185% of the US poverty line. And we implemented the program and we have grown it. This is a little hard to see, but in the first cohort, we started off with about 1,300 kids. By the time we got to the fourth cohort, we were up to about, I can't read that from here, but we were up to about 12,000 kids. We're currently admitting about 25,000 kids per year in Louisiana, and the very oldest of these children are graduating from high school, or should graduate from high school this year. These are simply the tests that are given in fourth grade in reading, math, science, and social studies. Again, red is the treatment. The yellow in this case, for every classroom that a treated child went into, we selected all other children in that classroom, entered them into a longitudinal panel, and we followed those children all the way through their school careers. What you see is that in all of these assessments, the kids who got the treatment outperform comparable children who did not, and this line through the treated group's graph, bar, is the state average of performance on that test for that cohort in that state. So in all instances, I believe this is the case, in all instances, these otherwise vulnerable children are performing better than the average of all students in the state of Louisiana. So we think that this offers some additional evidence that you can scale up, have a positive effect, and one of the things we're particularly working on now is trying to develop typologies of families who meet the characteristics of being below the federal poverty line. And I'll just end by saying we have identified 7 different types of families based on structural and functional characteristics within poverty, and those 7 types vary systematically in their risk for a child who will have an intellectual disability, and the function of intensive early interventions is to have maximum benefits for those children who are at greatest risk. That wouldn't have to be, and when we began, we had a pool of money we all bet into as to what the likely outcomes would be. And a lot of people thought, well, the children who are least at risk might derive the biggest benefits. So we have a lot more work to do, but I interpret this as being encouragement for being on a path in which we can bring science and public policy to bear. We are currently working with Reed Montague, assessing the children in the original study who are coming here to VTCRI in their 40s, and we're looking at their performance on a series of neuroeconomic tasks and doing structural and functional imaging of their brains. And so we're hoping to begin to wrap back around to the point that we know we have some differences. Now let's get further into the neurobiology and see if we can understand which particular aspects of their development in brain has been affected. Thank you.